In the scorching heat of the Arizona Territory in 1882, when the sun turned the desert into a furnace and water was more precious than gold, one act of kindness would spark a chain of events that would test the very limits of human courage and survival. This is not just another Wild West tale of cowboys and Indians. This is the extraordinary true story of how a single cup of water offered to a desperate Apache woman would save one man's life when 300 fierce warriors surrounded his remote ranch, thirsting for revenge. What you're about to discover challenges everything you thought you knew about the Apache Wars, about mercy in the wilderness, and about how one moment of compassion can echo through time in ways no one could ever imagine. This story will take you deep into the heart of Apache territory, where honor meant everything, and where the difference between life and death often came down to remembering a single act of human kindness. Prepare yourself for a journey into the untamed American frontier, where survival depended not just on guns and grit, but on understanding that sometimes the greatest weapon against hatred is an unexpected act of mercy. The morning sun blazed mercilessly across the Arizona Territory as Thomas McKenna stepped out of his modest ranch house, wiping sweat from his weathered brow. The year was 1882, and the land around his small cattle ranch stretched endlessly in all directions, a harsh and unforgiving landscape that had claimed the lives of countless settlers who dared to call it home. McKenna was different from most of the men who tried to tame this wilderness. Where others saw enemies in every shadow and reached for their guns at the first sign of trouble, he saw human beings struggling to survive in the same merciless environment that tested him daily. The Apache Wars had been raging for over 2 decades, turning the entire southwestern frontier into a battlefield where trust was a luxury few could afford. Stories of raids, scalping, and brutal revenge circulated through every trading post and settlement, creating an atmosphere of constant fear and suspicion. Most settlers viewed the Apache people as nothing more than savage obstacles to progress, while the Apache saw the encroaching white settlers as invaders destroying their ancient way of life. It was a cycle of violence that seemed to have no end, with each act of aggression breeding the next. McKenna had built his ranch on land that many considered too dangerous for settlement. The previous owner had abandoned it after losing half his cattle to Apache raids, and the land had sat empty for 3 years before McKenna arrived with nothing but determination and a different philosophy about coexistence. His neighbors thought he was either brave or foolish, possibly both. They warned him that his peaceful approach would get him killed, but McKenna believed there had to be another way to live on this land without constant warfare. His ranch was modest by any standard, consisting of a small wooden house, a barn, and corrals that held about 50 head of cattle. What made his property unique was the natural spring that bubbled up from deep underground, creating a small oasis in the desert. This spring was what had originally drawn the Apache to this area for centuries, and it was what made McKenna's land both valuable and dangerous. Water was life in the desert, and controlling water sources often meant controlling territory. On this particular morning, as McKenna checked his cattle and prepared for another day of ranch work, he noticed something unusual near the spring. At first, he thought it might be an animal, but as he moved closer, he realized it was a person. An Apache woman sat slumped beside the water, her large frame unmistakable even at a distance. She was clearly exhausted and appeared to be in distress. Most settlers would have reached for their rifle immediately. The presence of any Apache near their property was considered a threat, and the conventional wisdom was to shoot first and ask questions later. But something about the woman's posture, the way she sat motionless by the spring, made McKenna pause. She was not hiding or preparing for an attack. She was simply there, as if the strength had gone out of her completely. As he approached carefully, McKenna could see that the woman was indeed large by any standard, standing well over 6 feet tall with a powerful build that spoke of a life spent in the harsh desert environment. Her clothes were traditional Apache dress, but they were dusty and torn, suggesting she had traveled a great distance. Her face, marked by the sun and wind, showed signs of exhaustion and desperation that transcended any cultural barriers. This was a human being in need. The woman looked up as McKenna approached, her dark eyes showing no fear, only a kind of resigned acceptance. She did not move to flee or reach for any weapon. Instead, she simply watched him with the dignity that seemed to be an inherent part of Apache character, even in moments of vulnerability. There was something about her bearing that commanded respect, despite her obvious distress. McKenna stopped a few feet away and studied her face. What he saw there was not the savage warrior that frontier stories described, but a mother and grandmother whose journey had pushed her beyond her limits. Her hands, large and calloused from years of hard work, trembled slightly as she tried to cup water from the spring. She was dehydrated and exhausted, possibly lost, and clearly in need of help that went beyond just water. Without speaking, McKenna walked back to his house and returned with a large metal cup and some dried meat. He approached the spring slowly, filled the cup with cool, clear water, and offered it to the woman. She looked at him with surprise, as if kindness from a white settler was the last thing she had expected. For a moment, neither of them moved, and the silence stretched between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Finally, the woman reached out and accepted the cup. She drank deeply, the water running down her chin as she gulped it gratefully. McKenna could see the immediate relief in her eyes as the life-giving liquid restored some of her strength. When she had finished, she handed the cup back to him with a slight nod that conveyed more gratitude than any words could have expressed. McKenna refilled the cup and offered it again, along with the dried meat. The woman accepted both, eating slowly and carefully, as if she had not had a proper meal in days. As her strength returned, McKenna could see the intelligence and wisdom in her eyes. This was no ordinary person. There was something about her presence that suggested she held an important position within her community. They sat together by the spring for nearly an hour, sharing the water and the simple food McKenna had brought. Neither spoke the other's language fluently, but communication happened nonetheless through gestures and the universal language of human kindness. McKenna learned through broken Spanish and sign language that the woman had been traveling for many days, searching for her grandson who had been taken by Mexican slave traders. The story she managed to convey was heartbreaking. Her grandson, barely 12 years old, had been captured during a raid on a Mexican settlement where he had gone to trade horses. The boy was everything to her, the last of her bloodline, and she had set out alone to find him despite her advanced age and the dangers of traveling unprotected through hostile territory. Her journey had taken her far from Apache lands and into areas where she could not rely on the help of her people. McKenna was moved by her story and her obvious devotion to her grandson. He could see in her eyes the same love and concern that any grandmother would feel for a lost child. It was a reminder that beneath all the cultural differences and frontier conflicts, the basic human emotions of love, family, and sacrifice were universal. This woman was not his enemy, she was a fellow human being in distress. As the sun climbed higher and the heat became more intense, McKenna gestured toward his house, indicating that the woman was welcome to rest in the shade. She declined politely but gratefully, understanding that accepting such an invitation might put her benefactor in danger if other settlers discovered an Apache woman on his property. Instead, she rested under a large mesquite tree near the spring, where she could remain hidden from casual observation. McKenna brought her more food and water throughout the day, checking on her welfare without being intrusive. He could see that she was using the time to recover her strength for whatever journey lay ahead. There was something almost regal about the way she carried herself, even in her moment of need. She was clearly a person of significance within her community, someone accustomed to respect and responsibility. As evening approached, the woman prepared to leave. She stood slowly, testing her renewed strength, and walked to where McKenna was tending his cattle. Using a combination of gestures and the few Spanish words they shared, she managed to convey her gratitude for his kindness. But, more than that, she seemed to be making some kind of promise or commitment, though McKenna could not understand exactly what she meant. The woman reached into her clothing and withdrew a small piece of turquoise carved into an intricate design. She pressed it into McKenna's hand and closed his fingers around it. The stone was warm from being close to her body, and McKenna could feel the careful craftsmanship that had gone into its creation. This was clearly something of value, both materially and spiritually. Through her gestures, the woman made it clear that this gift was more than a simple token of gratitude. It seemed to carry some deeper significance, though McKenna could only guess at its meaning. In Apache culture, such gifts often carried spiritual protection or marked the giver's obligation to repay a kindness. McKenna accepted the stone graciously, understanding that to refuse it would be an insult to her dignity. As darkness began to fall across the desert, the woman prepared to continue her journey. McKenna offered to let her stay the night, but she declined, indicating that she needed to travel under cover of darkness for her safety and his. The frontier was too dangerous for an Apache woman to be seen near a white man's ranch during daylight hours. Before leaving, she walked to the spring one more time and drank deeply of its cool water. Then, she turned to McKenna and spoke several words in Apache, her tone formal and serious, as if she were making some kind of vow or declaration. Though he could not understand the words, McKenna sensed that something important had just occurred, that this moment would have consequences he could not yet imagine. The woman walked into the gathering darkness with renewed strength and purpose. McKenna watched her tall figure disappear into the desert landscape, wondering if he would ever see her again and hoping that she would find her grandson safe and well. He had no way of knowing that his simple act of kindness had just changed the course of his life in ways that would soon become dramatically clear. As he returned to his house that evening, McKenna examined the turquoise carving more closely by lamplight. The stone was beautiful, with intricate patterns that seemed to tell a story he could not read. He placed it carefully on his mantelpiece, thinking it would serve as a pleasant reminder of an unusual encounter that had touched his heart. What McKenna did not know was that the woman he had helped was no ordinary Apache. She was the grandmother of one of the most feared war chiefs in the territory, a woman whose word carried enormous weight within the complex tribal political structure. Her grandson, the boy she sought, was being trained to follow in his father's footsteps as a leader of warriors who had sworn to drive the white settlers from Apache lands. The kindness McKenna had shown was about to ripple through the Apache community in ways that would soon test every assumption about friendship and enmity on the frontier. The turquoise stone on his mantelpiece was more than a gift, it was a marker, a sign that would soon prove to be the difference between life and death when the desert erupted in violence and McKenna found himself standing alone against impossible odds. But, for now, on this quiet evening in 1882, Thomas McKenna went to sleep peacefully, unaware that his simple act of human decency had just set in motion a chain of events that would become legendary throughout the American Southwest. 3 weeks had passed since the encounter at the spring, and life at the McKenna Ranch had returned to its normal rhythm. The summer heat continued to bake the Arizona territory, making every day a test of endurance for both man and beast. McKenna went about his daily routine of caring for his cattle, maintaining his equipment, and protecting his precious water source from the constant threat of evaporation and contamination. The turquoise carving remained on his mantelpiece, catching the lamplight each evening as a reminder of the unusual meeting that had briefly touched his life. During these weeks, McKenna had heard disturbing rumors from the few travelers who passed through his isolated corner of the territory. The Apache wars were intensifying, with reports of increased raiding activity throughout the region. Mexican settlements across the border had suffered devastating attacks, and several American ranches had been burned to the ground. The territorial government had increased the military presence, but the vast distances and harsh terrain made it nearly impossible to protect every isolated homestead and settlement. The most troubling news came from a cavalry patrol that stopped at McKenna's ranch for water and supplies. The sergeant, a weathered man named Collins who had spent 15 years fighting Apache raiders, brought word that a prominent war chief named Nate had declared open warfare against all white settlements in the territory. According to military intelligence, Nate had united several Apache bands under his leadership and was planning coordinated attacks that would drive the settlers from traditional Apache lands once and for all. What made this news particularly ominous was that Nate was known for his tactical brilliance and his ability to inspire fierce loyalty among his followers. Unlike some Apache leaders who preferred hit-and-run tactics, Nate was willing to engage in prolonged sieges when the strategic advantage was worth the risk. He had successfully besieged a Mexican presidio for 3 weeks the previous year, ultimately forcing its abandonment when the defenders ran out of water and ammunition. Sergeant Collins warned McKenna that his ranch was particularly vulnerable because of its isolation and its valuable water source. He recommended that McKenna abandon the property temporarily and move to one of the larger settlements where there was military protection. When McKenna declined to leave, Collins shook his head grimly and advised him to keep his rifle loaded and his horse saddled at all times. But McKenna had invested everything he owned in his ranch, and, beyond that, he felt a deep connection to the land that went beyond mere financial considerations. The spring that bubbled up from deep underground seemed to him like a sacred trust, a responsibility that he could not simply abandon when times became difficult. He had come to this harsh country precisely because it demanded everything a man could give, and running away at the first sign of serious trouble felt like a betrayal of everything he had worked to build. The isolation that made his ranch dangerous also gave McKenna a unique perspective on the conflict that was consuming the territory. Unlike the settlers in the towns who saw Apache raids as senseless acts of savage violence, McKenna understood that the Apache were fighting for their homeland, their way of life, and their children's future. The land disputes were not simple matters of law and property rights, they were fundamental questions of survival and cultural identity that could not be resolved through negotiation or compromise. Still, understanding the Apache perspective did not make the threat any less real. McKenna took precautions without abandoning his principles. He moved his cattle closer to the house where he could watch them more carefully. He practiced shooting at targets every morning to keep his skills sharp. Most importantly, he developed an intricate knowledge of the terrain around his ranch, identifying potential hiding places, escape routes, and defensive positions that might prove crucial if trouble came. As July melted into August, the signs of increased Apache activity became impossible to ignore. McKenna found horse tracks near his spring that had not been made by his own animals or by the shoes of cavalry mounts. The tracks were unshod, indicating Indian ponies, and they appeared in different locations on several occasions. Someone was watching his ranch, studying his routines, and evaluating his defenses. The psychological pressure of being under constant observation was more wearing than McKenna had expected. Every sound in the night might be a signal between Apache scouts. Every movement on the horizon could be the advance guard of a raiding party. Sleep became difficult, and McKenna found himself starting at shadows and reaching for his rifle at the slightest provocation. One evening in late August, as McKenna sat on his porch trying to catch a cooling breeze, he noticed smoke rising from a location about 10 miles to the east. The smoke was too thick and too persistent to be a natural fire, and its location corresponded to the Henderson Ranch, where a family from Missouri had been trying to establish a sheep operation. McKenna saddled his horse immediately and rode toward the smoke, hoping to offer assistance if the family had survived whatever had happened. What he found when he arrived at the Henderson place was a scene of complete destruction. The house had been burned to the ground, the barn was a smoking ruin, and the bodies of sheep were scattered across the pasture. Most horrifying of all, McKenna found the bodies of John Henderson and his teenage son near the remains of their house, both killed by arrows and showing signs of the brutal scalping that had become the signature of Apache raids. Mrs. Henderson and her 2 younger children were nowhere to be found, and the tracks around the ranch told a clear story. They had been taken captive, probably to be sold to Mexican slave traders or to be adopted into Apache families to replace lost members. For the Henderson family, this was a tragedy beyond imagination, but, for the Apache raiders, it was simply another move in the larger war for control of the territory. McKenna buried the Henderson men as best he could and, then, rode hard for the nearest military outpost to report the attack. The cavalry response was swift but, ultimately futile. By the time the soldiers reached the Henderson ranch, the Apache raiders had vanished into the vast desert wilderness, taking their captives with them. The tracks led south toward Mexico, but pursuing them would require crossing international boundaries and risking diplomatic incidents that the territorial government wanted to avoid. The raid on the Henderson ranch sent shockwaves through the scattered settler community. Within days, 3 more families abandoned their homesteads and fled to larger towns where military protection was available. The territorial government issued warnings advising all isolated settlers to evacuate their properties until the Apache threat could be eliminated, but enforcement was impossible across such a vast area. McKenna attended the emergency meeting that was called at the territorial capital to discuss the crisis. The mood among the assembled ranchers and farmers was angry and fearful, with many demanding immediate military action against all Apache bands regardless of their involvement in recent raids. The territorial governor, a political appointee from back east who had little understanding of frontier realities, promised increased patrols but admitted that the military resources available were inadequate for protecting every isolated settlement. The meeting revealed the deep divisions within the settler community about how to respond to the Apache threat. Some demanded total war, the complete removal of all Apache people from the territory regardless of the cost in lives and resources. Others, including McKenna, argued for a more measured response that would distinguish between hostile bands and those Apache groups that had not participated in raids. The debate was passionate and, sometimes angry, with accusations of cowardice leveled against those who counseled restraint. During the meeting, McKenna learned disturbing details about the scope of Nature's war plans. Military intelligence suggested that the war chief was assembling the largest Apache fighting force in decades, with warriors from multiple bands united under his leadership. The plan apparently involved simultaneous attacks on all major settlements and supply lines, designed to make the territory ungovernable and force a complete withdrawal of white settlers. What made Nature's strategy particularly dangerous was his understanding of settler psychology. Rather than simply raiding for livestock and supplies, his warriors were targeting families and destroying entire homesteads to create an atmosphere of terror that would drive people away even from areas that had not been directly attacked. The raid on the Henderson Ranch fit perfectly into this pattern, serving as a warning to other isolated settlers that nowhere was safe. As McKenna rode back to his ranch after the meeting, he wrestled with the decision of whether to stay or abandon everything he had built. The rational choice was clearly to leave. His ranch was isolated, his water source made him a natural target, and he had no family obligations that required him to remain. But something deeper than rational calculation kept him committed to staying. Perhaps it was stubborn pride, or perhaps it was a genuine belief that running away would not solve the larger problems that were tearing the territory apart. That night, as McKenna sat in his house cleaning his rifle and checking his ammunition supply, he thought about the Apache woman he had helped at the spring. He wondered if she had found her grandson, and he wondered what her people thought about the escalating violence that was consuming the region. Did she remember the kindness he had shown, or had the larger conflict made such individual acts of humanity irrelevant? Unknown to McKenna, his questions were about to be answered in ways that would test every assumption he had made about the nature of the conflict and the possibility of human connection across cultural boundaries. The woman he had helped was indeed safe, and she had found her grandson, but the story of their reunion was more complex and more tragic than McKenna could have imagined. The boy she had sought so desperately had been rescued from Mexican slave traders by a war party led by his father, who was none other than Nate himself. The reunion had been joyful, but it had also confirmed Nature's belief that only through overwhelming military force could the Apache people protect their children and their way of life. The rescue had cost the lives of 3 young Apache warriors, and their deaths had hardened Nature's heart against any possibility of peaceful coexistence with the white settlers. When the grandmother told Nate about the kindness she had received from a white rancher, the war chief listened respectfully but dismissed the incident as an anomaly that did not change the larger reality of the conflict. One act of kindness, he argued, could not balance the scales against the systematic destruction of Apache lands and the ongoing threat to Apache children. The war would continue as planned, and every white settler in Apache territory would be considered an enemy combatant. But the grandmother's story had planted a seed of doubt in Nature's mind. If one white man could show mercy to an Apache woman in distress, perhaps the conflict was not as absolute as he had believed. Perhaps there were possibilities for discrimination and targeting that could preserve some hope for future coexistence while still achieving the military objectives necessary for Apache survival. As August gave way to September and the desert began to show the first subtle signs of approaching autumn, both McKenna and Nate were making preparations for a confrontation that seemed increasingly inevitable. Neither man could have predicted that their first encounter would involve not just questions of survival, but fundamental questions about the nature of human character and the possibility of honor even in the midst of war. The stage was being set for a drama that would test everything both men believed about courage, mercy, and the bonds that can exist between enemies who see each other's humanity. The turquoise stone on McKenna's mantelpiece was about to become much more than a memento of an unusual encounter. It was about to become the key to a test of character that would be remembered throughout the Southwest for generations to come. The first week of September brought an unusual stillness to the Arizona territory that made experienced frontiersmen nervous. The desert had its own rhythms and moods, and this particular quiet felt like the calm before a devastating storm. Even the wildlife seemed to sense something approaching. Cattle gathered closer to water sources, birds flew in restless patterns, and the usually bold coyotes kept to the deepest shadows during their nightly hunts. McKenna felt the tension in his bones as he went about his morning chores on September 8, 1882. The air itself seemed charged with potential energy, like the moments before a thunderstorm when every living thing holds its breath in anticipation. He had learned to trust these instincts during his years on the frontier, where survival often depended on reading signs that more civilized places never provided. His cattle were restless, bunching together near the spring instead of spreading out to graze in their usual patterns. The horses in his corral showed the whites of their eyes and, startled at sounds too faint for human ears to detect. Most telling of all, the Apache scouts who had been watching his ranch from a distance for weeks had suddenly vanished, leaving no tracks and no sign of their presence. McKenna understood that the disappearance of the scouts likely meant that whatever had been planned was now ready to be executed. In Apache warfare, the watchers withdrew just before the fighters arrived, ensuring that no warning could be given and no preparation could be made. The absence of observation was often the most ominous sign possible, indicating that the time for watching was over and the time for action had begun. Throughout the territory, military commanders were receiving similar reports of Apache scouts withdrawing from their established observation points. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental, suggesting a coordinated plan that involved multiple Apache bands acting in concert. Colonel William Morrison, the territorial military commander, had seen this pattern before during his 15 years of frontier service, and he knew it meant that Nate was about to launch his long-anticipated campaign. Morrison immediately ordered increased patrols and sent urgent warnings to all isolated settlements and ranches, but he knew that his resources were stretched far too thin to provide adequate protection for everyone in the territory. His 200 soldiers could not be in all places at once, and the Apache had chosen their timing well. It would take days for reinforcements to arrive from neighboring territories, and, by then, the damage would already be done. The warning messages that rode out from military headquarters that morning would not reach McKenna for another 2 days, and, by then, it would be too late for evacuation. The isolation that had made his ranch attractive to him as a place to build an independent life had also made it one of the most vulnerable targets in the entire territory. His spring, which had seemed like a blessing, was about to become the focal point of a confrontation that would test everything he believed about courage, principle, and human nature. On the same morning that McKenna sensed danger approaching his ranch, Nate was conducting a final war council with his assembled chiefs and warriors in a hidden canyon 50 miles to the southeast. 300 men had gathered for this campaign, representing the largest Apache fighting force assembled in over a decade. They came from different bands that had put aside traditional rivalries to unite against what they saw as an existential threat to their people and their way of life. The war chief himself was an imposing figure who commanded respect through both his physical presence and his reputation for tactical brilliance. Nate stood well over 6 feet tall, with the lean, muscular build of a man who had spent his entire life in the harsh desert environment. His face bore the scars of numerous battles, but his eyes burned with an intelligence and determination that marked him as a natural leader of men. As Nate addressed his warriors, he spoke not just of the immediate military objectives, but of the larger historical forces that had brought them to this moment. The white settlers, he explained, were not merely individuals seeking land and opportunity, they were the advance guard of a civilization that would ultimately destroy everything the Apache people held sacred. Every ranch, every town, every mine was another step toward the complete transformation of Apache lands into something alien and hostile to Apache survival. The strategy Nate outlined was designed to send an unmistakable message to both the territorial government and the federal authorities in Washington. By demonstrating that the Apache could strike simultaneously across the entire territory, he hoped to prove that the cost of continued expansion would be higher than the American government was willing to pay. If the settlers could not be protected, they would leave voluntarily, returning the land to its rightful inhabitants. The plan called for coordinated attacks on 3 major settlements, the destruction of key supply lines, and the siege of isolated ranches that controlled important water sources. McKenna's ranch had been selected not just because of its strategic location, but because its destruction would send a powerful symbolic message. The spring that bubbled up from deep underground had been sacred to Apache people for generations, and its occupation by a white settler represented the kind of cultural violation that demanded a response. But, as Nate distributed final assignments to his war party leaders, he was interrupted by an unexpected voice. His grandmother, the woman McKenna had helped at the spring, stepped forward from where she had been sitting with the other elders and asked permission to speak. The assembled warriors showed immediate respect for her age and wisdom, falling silent as she approached the central fire. What happened next was unprecedented in Nate's experience as a war leader. His grandmother, speaking with the authority that came from her age and her position within the family structure, told the story of her encounter with the white rancher who lived near the sacred spring. She described McKenna's kindness in detail, emphasizing not just his willingness to share water and food, but his recognition of her humanity and dignity during a moment of desperate need. The warriors listened to her story with growing amazement. Acts of kindness between Apache people and white settlers had become so rare that they seemed almost mythical. Most of the younger warriors had never experienced anything but hostility from white people, and many found it difficult to believe that such kindness was possible. Some whispered that the old woman must have been confused or that she was exaggerating the significance of a minor encounter. But Nate knew his grandmother too well to doubt her word. She was known throughout the Apache community for her wisdom and her absolute honesty, even when the truth was difficult to accept. If she said that a white man had shown her genuine kindness, then it was certainly true. The question was whether this single act of mercy should have any influence on the military campaign that had been months in planning. The war chief found himself facing a dilemma that had no precedent in Apache military tradition. His grandmother was not asking him to abandon the campaign or to spare all white settlers. She was asking him to consider whether the man who had helped her deserved a different fate than the other settlers in the territory. It was a request that combined family loyalty, personal honor, and strategic considerations in ways that made simple decisions impossible. As the War Council continued into the night, Nate wrestled with questions that went to the heart of Apache values and traditions. Honor demanded that kindness be repaid with kindness, but military necessity required that strategic objectives be pursued without sentiment or favoritism. How could he balance his obligations as a grandson against his responsibilities as a war chief? How could he show mercy to one enemy without appearing weak or inconsistent to his followers? The debate among the warriors was intense and sometimes heated. The older men, who remembered a time when relations between Apache and white people were more complex and nuanced, were more willing to consider exceptions and special circumstances. The younger warriors, who had grown up during the most violent period of the Apache Wars, argued that any deviation from total warfare would be seen as weakness and would encourage the settlers to believe that Apache resolve was wavering. Finally, Nate made a decision that reflected both his respect for his grandmother and his understanding of military reality. The campaign would proceed as planned, with one significant modification. McKenna's ranch would be besieged rather than simply destroyed, giving the rancher an opportunity to demonstrate whether his kindness to an Apache woman represented genuine character or merely a momentary impulse. If McKenna showed courage and honor during the siege, his life would be spared and he would be allowed to leave Apache territory unharmed. This decision satisfied neither the advocates for total war nor those who wanted McKenna spared outright, but it represented a compromise that acknowledged the complexity of the situation while maintaining the military pressure necessary for strategic success. More importantly, it created a test that would reveal the true character of both the white rancher and the Apache war chief in ways that neither could have anticipated. As dawn broke over the hidden canyon where the War Council had been held, 300 Apache warriors began their final preparations for the most ambitious military campaign they had ever attempted. Weapons were checked, horses were prepared, and final prayers were offered to the spirits that watched over Apache people in times of war. The campaign that would begin within hours would determine not just the immediate fate of countless settlers, but the future relationship between two peoples who had found themselves locked in a struggle that seemed to admit no possibility of peaceful resolution. McKenna, meanwhile, continued his morning routine at the ranch, unaware that he had become the subject of intense debate among his enemies or that his simple act of kindness 3 weeks earlier was about to be tested in ways that would challenge every assumption he had made about human nature and the possibility of honor in warfare. The turquoise stone on his mantelpiece caught the morning light, seeming to pulse with an inner fire that suggested its significance was about to be revealed. By noon on September 9th, the first Apache war parties had begun moving toward their assigned targets throughout the territory. The largest force, led by Nate himself, was riding hard toward McKenna's ranch and the sacred spring that had been the source of both blessing and conflict for countless generations. The confrontation that was about to unfold would become one of the most unusual episodes in the history of the Apache Wars, a test of character that would be remembered long after the larger conflict had ended. As the sun reached its peak in the cloudless desert sky, both McKenna and Nate were approaching a moment that would define not just their individual fates, but their understanding of what it meant to be human in a world that often seemed to offer no alternative to violence and hatred. The stage was set for a drama that would test the limits of courage, honor, and the possibility of mercy even between mortal enemies. The afternoon of September 9, 1882, began like any other at the McKenna Ranch, with the relentless desert sun beating down on the parched landscape and the precious spring continuing its eternal flow from deep underground. McKenna was repairing a section of fence that his cattle had damaged during the night when he first noticed the dust cloud on the southern horizon. At first, he thought it might be a cavalry patrol or perhaps a supply wagon making its way to one of the distant mining camps, but, as the cloud grew larger and began to spread wider, he realized that whatever was approaching was much larger than any normal party of travelers. His blood ran cold as he understood what he was seeing. The dust cloud was being raised by a large group of riders moving at speed across the desert floor, and, in this territory, at this time, such a group could only mean one thing: Apache raiders were approaching his ranch in force. McKenna dropped his tools and ran toward his house, his mind racing through the limited options available to a single man facing what appeared to be overwhelming odds. The first decision McKenna had to make was whether to flee immediately or to make a stand at his ranch. His horse was fresh and fast, and if he left right now, he might be able to outrun the approaching raiders and reach the safety of the nearest military outpost. But abandoning his ranch meant abandoning everything he had worked to build, including the spring that was both his greatest asset and his greatest vulnerability. More importantly, fleeing without even attempting to defend his property went against every instinct he had developed during his years on the frontier. McKenna made his decision in the space of a heartbeat. He would stay and fight, not because he expected to win against such overwhelming odds, but because running away felt like a betrayal of everything he believed about courage and principle. If he was going to die, he would die defending the life he had chosen to build in this harsh but beautiful land. Moving with practiced efficiency, McKenna secured his cattle in the corral closest to his house and brought his horse into the barn where it would be protected from stray bullets. He filled every container he could find with water from the spring, knowing that if the siege lasted more than a few hours, access to water would become crucial to his survival. Most importantly, he loaded every rifle and pistol he owned and positioned ammunition where it would be easily accessible during the fighting. As he made these preparations, McKenna could see the approaching riders more clearly. There were far more of them than he had initially realized, perhaps 200 or 300 warriors mounted on fast desert ponies, their weapons glinting in the afternoon sunlight. At the head of this formidable force rode a tall figure whose bearing and position marked him as the war chief in command of the entire operation. The sight of so many Apache warriors approaching his ranch should have filled McKenna with terror, and, indeed, his heart was pounding with the adrenaline of mortal danger. But, mixed with the fear was a strange sense of honor at being considered worthy of such attention. Whatever else this siege might prove, it was a recognition that his ranch and his spring were valuable enough to warrant the attention of a major war party led by one of the most feared chiefs in the territory. Nate called a halt to his war party while they were still outside rifle range of McKenna's house. The war chief studied the layout of the ranch with the eye of a professional soldier, noting the defensive advantages and weaknesses of the position. The house was well built and positioned to command good fields of fire in all directions. The corrals and barn provided additional cover, and the spring itself was located in a depression that would be difficult to attack directly. What impressed Nate most about the ranch's defenses was their obviously practical nature. McKenna had not built his property like a fort, with military defense as the primary consideration. Instead, he had simply chosen his positions well and built everything solidly, creating natural defensive advantages that would make a direct assault costly even against a single defender. This spoke well of the rancher's intelligence and his understanding of frontier realities. The war chief rode forward alone, staying just outside rifle range, and called out in Spanish, asking McKenna to come out of his house for a parley. After a few moments, the door opened and a single figure emerged, rifle in hand but held in a non-threatening position. Even at this distance, Nate could see that McKenna was not cowering in fear but was instead standing straight and tall, presenting himself with dignity despite the desperate nature of his situation. The two men faced each other across perhaps 100 yards of desert terrain, each taking the measure of his opponent. McKenna saw a tall, imposing figure who carried himself with the confidence of a natural leader. His clothing and weapons marked him as Apache, but there was something about his bearing that suggested European military training or at least observation of European military customs. This was clearly a formidable enemy, but also one who might be willing to observe certain rules of warfare. Nate, for his part, saw a middle-aged white man of average height but solid build, whose calm demeanor under extreme pressure suggested considerable personal courage. The rancher's rifle was well maintained and held with the familiarity of long practice, indicating that he would not be an easy opponent despite being heavily outnumbered. Most importantly, there was something about the man's stance and bearing that reminded the war chief of his grandmother's description of her encounter at the spring. Speaking in careful Spanish, Nate identified himself and explained that McKenna's ranch was located on land that had belonged to Apache people for countless generations. The spring, in particular, was sacred to Apache tribes and had been used by his people long before any white settlers had arrived in the territory. By rights, Nate declared, the land should be returned to Apache control, and McKenna should leave immediately if he wanted to preserve his life. McKenna listened to this speech with growing understanding of the cultural and historical forces that had brought this moment about. He had known from the beginning that his ranch was located in territory that Apache people considered their homeland, and he had tried to be a respectful neighbor to the extent that the volatile political situation allowed. But he had also invested everything he owned in this land, and, more than that, he had come to love the harsh beauty of the desert and the sense of independence that frontier life provided. In response to Nate's ultimatum, McKenna spoke slowly and carefully, using the Spanish words he knew and supplementing with gestures where language failed him. He acknowledged that Apache people had lived on this land long before his arrival, and he expressed respect for their connection to the spring and the surrounding territory. But he also explained that he had bought the land legally and had tried to be a good steward of its resources. He was willing to share the spring water with anyone who needed it, as he had proven in his encounter with Nate's grandmother, but he was not willing to abandon his home and his life's work without a fight. As McKenna spoke, he noticed a subtle change in the war chief's expression. There was something almost like recognition in Nate's eyes, as if the rancher's words had confirmed something the Apache leader had already suspected. McKenna did not understand the significance of this change, but he sensed that his fate might depend on factors beyond his immediate control. Nate was indeed remembering his grandmother's account of her encounter with this rancher. The dignity and courtesy McKenna was showing even in this desperate situation matched exactly what the old woman had described. This was clearly the same man who had offered water and food to a desperate Apache woman, asking nothing in return except the satisfaction of helping another human being in need. The war chief found himself facing the same dilemma that had troubled him during the war council. Military necessity demanded that he secure the spring and eliminate any threat to Apache control of the area. But honor and family obligation required that he acknowledge the debt his family owed to this particular white man. The solution he had worked out during the war council would now be put to the test. Speaking with formal ceremony that marked the importance of his words, Nate announced that McKenna would be given an opportunity to prove his courage and character. The ranch would be besieged, but it would not be overrun immediately. If McKenna could defend his position with honor and courage, showing the kind of bravery that warriors respected, his life would be spared and he would be allowed to leave Apache territory safely. However, if he showed cowardice or attempted to flee during the night, he would be hunted down and killed without mercy. McKenna understood that he was being offered something unprecedented in the violent history of Apache settler relations, a chance to earn his life through courage rather than simply being killed outright. The offer was both generous and terrifying, since it meant that he would have to prove himself worthy of respect through combat against impossible odds. But it was also the best chance he was likely to get, and he accepted the terms immediately. As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, both sides prepared for a siege that would test not just military skills, but fundamental questions about honor, courage, and the possibility of respect between enemies. Nate positioned his warriors in a loose circle around the ranch, close enough to maintain constant pressure but far enough away to avoid unnecessary casualties from McKenna's rifle fire. The Apache warriors settled in for what they expected to be a brief siege. Most of them believed that a single white man, no matter how brave, could not hold out against 300 determined fighters for more than a few hours. They had seen other isolated settlers break under the psychological pressure of being surrounded, often making fatal mistakes that turned defensive advantage into sudden disaster. But, as the first night of the siege fell over the McKenna ranch, it became clear that this would not be a typical confrontation. McKenna had prepared well for exactly this kind of situation, and he understood both the tactical and psychological aspects of defensive warfare. More importantly, he was fighting not just for his life, but for his right to live according to his own principles in the land he had chosen to call home. The first probing attack came just after sunset, when a small group of Apache warriors attempted to approach the spring under cover of darkness. McKenna's rifle fire drove them back without casualties, but the exchange established that the rancher was alert, well-armed, and capable of accurate shooting even in limited visibility. The siege would require patience and careful planning rather than a simple overwhelming assault. As the desert night settled over the ranch, McKenna found himself alone in his house, surrounded by enemies who could attack from any direction at any moment. The isolation was absolute, and the odds were hopeless by any rational calculation. Yet somehow, as he checked his weapons and planned his defensive strategy, McKenna felt a strange sense of peace. He was finally facing the ultimate test that frontier life had always promised, and he was discovering reserves of courage and determination that he had not known he possessed. The turquoise stone on his mantelpiece seemed to glow in the lamplight, reminding him of the encounter that had somehow led to this moment. McKenna did not yet understand the full significance of that meeting at the spring, but he was beginning to sense that his simple act of kindness had created connections and obligations that would influence the outcome of the siege in ways he could not have imagined. Outside in the darkness, 300 Apache warriors settled in for a night of waiting and watching, while their war chief contemplated the strange turn of events that had made this siege as much a test of honor as a military operation. The confrontation that would unfold over the next several days would become legendary throughout the Southwest, remembered not just as a remarkable display of courage under impossible odds, but as a moment when two very different cultures found a way to respect each other's honor even in the midst of deadly conflict. The siege of McKenna's ranch continued through the night and into the second day, becoming a test of endurance and will that neither side had anticipated. As the sun rose on September 10, both McKenna and Nate found themselves engaged in a confrontation that had evolved far beyond simple military objectives into something approaching a ritual of honor that would determine not just the fate of one man, but the possibility of respect between sworn enemies. McKenna had spent the night in a state of constant alertness, moving from window to window in his house, watching for any sign of Apache movement in the moonlight. The psychological pressure of being surrounded by hundreds of warriors who could attack at any moment was more exhausting than any physical labor he had ever performed. Every shadow might conceal an enemy, every sound might signal the beginning of a final assault, and every moment of quiet might be the calm before overwhelming violence. Yet as the hours passed, McKenna began to notice something unexpected about the Apache siege tactics. Despite having overwhelming numerical superiority, Nate's warriors were not pressing their attack with the relentless aggression that characterized most Apache raids. Instead, they seemed to be conducting a careful, almost ceremonial siege that tested McKenna's defense without unnecessarily risking Apache lives. It was as if the war chief was more interested in observing McKenna's behavior under pressure than in simply overwhelming his position through brute force. The first serious assault came at dawn, when 20 Apache warriors approached the ranch from 3 different directions simultaneously. McKenna's rifle fire was accurate and deadly, dropping 2 attackers and forcing the others to retreat to cover. But, even during this exchange, there was something restrained about the Apache tactics. They advanced with courage but not with the reckless fury that marked warriors fighting for total victory. Instead, they seemed to be testing McKenna's marksmanship and his ability to maintain effective fire under pressure. After the morning attack was repulsed, an unusual quiet settled over the battlefield. Nate called for another parley, riding forward to the same position he had occupied the day before. This time, however, he was accompanied by an elderly Apache woman whose presence transformed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. McKenna recognized her immediately as the woman he had helped at the spring 3 weeks earlier, and the sight of her filled him with a complex mixture of emotions. The grandmother's presence explained much about the unusual nature of the siege McKenna was experiencing. Her testimony about his kindness had clearly influenced Nate's decision-making, creating obligations and considerations that went far beyond normal military strategy. McKenna understood now that he was not just fighting for his life, he was being tested to determine whether his earlier act of mercy reflected genuine character or merely expedient behavior. Speaking through his grandmother, who served as both translator and witness, Nate explained the true nature of the test McKenna was facing. The rancher had shown kindness to an Apache woman in distress, asking nothing in return except the satisfaction of helping another human being. Such behavior was rare enough between Apache people and white settlers that it deserved special recognition. If McKenna could demonstrate similar honor and courage in defending his ranch, he would earn the right to leave Apache territory safely, with the understanding that he would not return. McKenna listened to this explanation with growing amazement and respect for the complexity of Apache moral thinking. He had expected to face a simple choice between fighting to the death or surrendering to certain execution. Instead, he was being offered an opportunity to prove that his character was worthy of respect, even from his enemies. The test was dangerous and the odds were still overwhelming, but there was something almost noble about a conflict conducted according to such principles. The grandmother spoke directly to McKenna in the few Spanish words she knew, expressing her gratitude once again for his kindness and her hope that he would survive the test her grandson had created. Her presence served as a reminder that even in the midst of warfare, individual acts of humanity could create connections that transcended cultural and political boundaries. The water McKenna had shared at the spring had created a debt of honor that was now being repaid in the most unlikely circumstances imaginable. As the second day of the siege progressed, the conflict took on an almost ritualistic quality that distinguished it from normal military operations. Apache warriors would approach McKenna's defensive positions with obvious courage, but they would withdraw when driven back by rifle fire rather than pressing attacks that might result in heavy casualties. McKenna, for his part, aimed to wound rather than kill when possible, demonstrating that he understood the difference between defending himself and engaging in unnecessary slaughter. This restraint on both sides created a unique dynamic that allowed the siege to continue without the massive bloodshed that normally characterized Apache raids. Word of the unusual confrontation began to spread among the warriors, many of whom had never witnessed such a display of mutual respect between Apache people and white settlers. Some of the younger warriors questioned whether such restraint was appropriate, but Nate's authority was absolute, and his decision to conduct the siege according to principles of honor was accepted without further argument. The most dramatic moment of the entire siege came on the afternoon of the second day, when McKenna's water supply began to run low. He had filled every available container at the beginning of the siege, but 2 days of desert heat and constant vigilance had depleted his reserves faster than anticipated. The irony of potentially dying of thirst within sight of the spring that had made his ranch valuable was not lost on either McKenna or the Apache warriors watching his predicament. Nate observed McKenna's growing desperation with interest rather than satisfaction. The test he had created was designed to measure courage and character, not to inflict needless suffering on a man who had shown kindness to his family. When it became clear that McKenna might be forced to abandon his defensive position simply to reach water, the war chief made another unprecedented decision. Calling for a temporary ceasefire, Nate personally carried a large container of water to within rifle range of McKenna's house and left it where the rancher could retrieve it safely. This gesture of mercy during active combat was so unusual that several of the younger Apache warriors openly questioned their war chief's judgment. Nate silenced their protests with a speech about the nature of honor and the importance of conducting warfare according to principles that elevated both sides above the level of mere brutality. McKenna's response to this unexpected mercy revealed the depth of his character in ways that impressed even his enemies. Instead of simply drinking the water Nate had provided, McKenna used most of it to care for his cattle, ensuring that the animals under his protection would not suffer from his decision to make a stand at the ranch. Only after the cattle had been watered did McKenna drink what remained, and then, sparingly, as if he expected the siege to continue for many more days. This display of responsibility toward animals under his care resonated strongly with Apache values, which emphasized the sacred nature of the relationship between humans and the natural world. Many of the warriors who had questioned Nate's lenient treatment of McKenna began to understand why their war chief considered this particular white man worthy of respect. Here was someone who understood that courage involved more than personal survival; it required accepting responsibility for all life that depended on one's protection. As the third day of the siege dawned, both sides found themselves in an unprecedented situation. McKenna had demonstrated conclusively that his earlier kindness to Nate's grandmother reflected genuine character rather than momentary impulse. He had shown courage under extreme pressure, skill in defensive combat, and, most importantly, a sense of honor that Apache warriors could recognize and respect. The test that Nate had created had been passed completely, but both the warchief and the rancher had been changed by the experience in ways neither had anticipated. The resolution of the siege came not through military victory or defeat, but through a formal recognition of honor that transcended the boundaries of culture and conflict. Nate rode forward one final time, accompanied by several of his senior warriors and his grandmother, to announce that McKenna had proven himself worthy of respect and would be allowed to leave Apache territory safely. The rancher would have one day to gather his personal possessions and drive his cattle to the territorial boundary, after which the land would revert to Apache control. McKenna accepted these terms with dignity and gratitude, understanding that he had been given something far more valuable than his life. He had been recognized as an honorable man by people who had every reason to consider him an enemy, and he had participated in a test of character that had elevated both sides above the normal brutality of frontier warfare. The ranch he was leaving behind had given him more than just a place to live. It had provided an opportunity to discover reserves of courage and principle that he had not known he possessed. The final gesture of the siege came from McKenna himself, who walked to his mantelpiece and retrieved the turquoise stone that Nature's grandmother had given him. Approaching the warchief with formal ceremony, McKenna returned the stone to its original owner, explaining through gestures that he understood its significance and wanted to ensure that it remained with Apache people where it belonged. This act of cultural sensitivity and respect completed the transformation of what had begun as a military confrontation into something approaching a sacred ritual of mutual recognition. As McKenna loaded his wagon and prepared his cattle for the journey to territorial boundaries, hundreds of Apache warriors watched in respectful silence. Word of the unusual siege had spread throughout the territory, and the story would be told and retold for generations among both Apache and settler communities. It became a legend that demonstrated the possibility of honor and respect even between mortal enemies, proving that individual acts of humanity could create connections strong enough to transcend even the most violent conflicts. The immediate aftermath of the siege saw significant changes in Apache settler relations throughout the territory. Nature's demonstration that Apache people could distinguish between individual character and group identity encouraged other settlers to reconsider their assumptions about Apache culture and values. Similarly, many Apache warriors who had participated in the siege carried away a new understanding that some white settlers were capable of behavior worthy of respect and consideration. McKenna established a new ranch near the territorial capital, where he became a respected voice for peaceful relations between settlers and Apache people. His story of the siege spread throughout the Southwest, inspiring other frontiersmen to consider whether conflict was truly inevitable or whether individual actions might create possibilities for coexistence. The ranch near the sacred spring became a symbol of the complex relationships that were possible when people chose to see humanity in their enemies rather than simply viewing them as obstacles to be eliminated. Nate continued his military campaigns throughout the territory, but with a new understanding that warfare could be conducted according to principles that preserved honor and dignity for both sides. His reputation as a warchief who combined tactical brilliance with moral principle made him a more effective leader and ultimately contributed to negotiated settlements that might not otherwise have been possible. The sacred spring that had been at the center of the confrontation continued to flow from deep underground, providing life-giving water for Apache people who returned to their traditional camping grounds in the area. But now it also carried the memory of an extraordinary encounter between cultures, a reminder that even in the harshest environments and the most violent times, individual acts of kindness and courage could create connections that transcended all boundaries of race, culture, and conflict. The story of the siege became more than just a remarkable episode in frontier history. It became a testament to the possibility that human beings could find ways to honor each other's dignity even in the midst of seemingly irreconcilable differences. The turquoise stone that had symbolized this connection was passed down through generations of Nature's family, carrying with it the memory of a time when enemies discovered that they could respect each other without abandoning their principles or their commitment to their people's survival. In the end, the siege of McKenna's ranch proved that the American frontier was not just a place of violence and cultural destruction, but also a testing ground for human character where individuals could transcend the limitations of their time and circumstances to create moments of genuine honor and mutual respect that would be remembered long after the immediate conflicts had been forgotten.